Chapter 3 Chanticleer. It happened that Russell fell asleep beneath a maple tree. Therefore to that maple, all solitary in the center of the wood, the animals repaired, and for a while it became their home. Well, they had no coop, no roof of any sort. Worm had made them nomads, and life was bare because of him. Life was bare, but life was heavy nonetheless. The animals had lost the innocence of ignorance, and Lord Chanticleer in particular suffered the knowledge of the presence of Worm. He measured all his commands and all his activities against the size of that monster, and they were, all of them, diminished. He didn't plan, but that Worm was in the plan. He walked abroad, and Worm attended him. He looked on the sleeping fox, and he saw the work of the serpent. He watched his hens find roost in the maple tree, clucking, gossiping with one another, trusting their souls to sleep, and he saw the prey of the evil one. In the evening they were endangered, and the dark of the night was perilous. So then evening and night were no longer comforts to close the day. Every evening, every night arrived as another threat of the enemy. Chanticleer wrestled the darkness. And every morning the prayer of the rooster was the same. Why? Why is Worm? Worm, that subterranean serpent, no one deserved so ruinous an evil underneath her feet. No one had defied him, no one had sinned enough to justify his presence in the universe, absolutely no one. Yet he was. He existed, long and foul and putrefying, a single muscle, a massive contracting muscle in the round earth. Why? And he hated God with a furious hatred, but he focused his spite on the animals, and they were the ones who suffered his cruelty. But who were they? Animals, plain animals, yet he murdered them. He killed the mouse's husband. He killed the wee widow mouse herself so that her children were orphaned. He killed the children of Chanticleer and Pertelote early before the war began. He killed their nurse. He killed fools and heroes alike, and when the battles began, the killing was indiscriminate. The memory, now unspeakable, the beautiful nimbus down on his knees, his stag's face raised to heaven, his mouth agape, his pleading as silent as the spheres, and the screaming of others was his answer. For the foxes and the otters and the rabbits died, killed, and geese and duck and swan, bees, ants, birds, pigs, sheep, the meek of the earth, slaughtered, killed, for no sinning of their own, but Worm. Worm was there. Worm was seeking his freedom. Worm had weakened them. Now Worm had split the crust of the earth like a rind, and the animals looked into the gorge, and the animals saw him face to face, that mighty serpent, and all were horrified, and all of them transfixed, all but one. Mundocani Dog took him a stick and taunted Worm. Ha! And when the Worm's eye turned to see this speck, why, Mundocani leaped over the cliff. Ha ha! Down and down the gorge, the earth crack, Worm's hatch, and landed fighting on the monster's eyeball, pierced it, and slashed it to madness, so that the great slick muscle doubled on himself. And the earth crack couldn't stand the spasm. It collapsed in earthquake. It thundered shut. So Worm was contained. So ha to the monster imprisoned again. So Worm crawled the belly of the world, so. But so what? He was still alive for all of that, and he took with him a friend, beloved above all others, that humble Mundocani. When one went down, they both went down together. Oh, how shall we live without the gentle Mundocani? How can we ever be complete again? Oh Worm, oh fire and fury Worm! Mighty God, you talk to us. Tell us, why does Worm exist? He killed peace. He killed their deeper trust and sweet security. Hens had rather more suspicious eyes than ever they did in the past. Chanticleer's canonical crows were becoming more needful than ever before, more necessary than the rising of the sun. None the less, ironically, they were less believed than ever before because of the war which came in spite of them, because of Worm. Oh, Chanticleer crowed crows nearly baroque for subtlety, intelligence, and beauty. He went extraordinary lengths to make each crow a something, a memorable blessing, each in itself, all tender to the chickens. But sometimes he wondered whether those lengths didn't measure a personal doubt. And could it be that the grander, more wonderful the crow on its outside, the emptier it was at its core? Mighty God, please talk to us. Explain it, explain. Why is Worm? It is recorded with no surprise that the animals, under Chanticleer's protection, even the children hatched after the war, lived grimly, chilly toward the world, spare regarding their own needs, and of no particular hope in the future. Worm had murdered cheer. Cold realists were these animals, of the experienced eye, as fearful of believing as they were of creeds themselves, when the object of either was invisible. On the other hand, their tenderness toward one another grew intense. How they loved each other, when suddenly the life in the other seemed so precarious, so rare, so precious. How solicitous they were for the sick one's health, and how glad at his healing, for it was something of themselves had healed. One was in all, and all were joined to one. Well, all had the same transfiguring memory, hadn't they? And all the same enemy, and he was great, and they were few. Aye, sorrow binds poor hearts, and weakness isn't ashamed to hide in the binding. They loved each other. It was nearly painful how much they loved each other, grim to the world, watchful of a fox's convalescence. And here is an irony certainly. What kept Worm within his prison, this by the cosmic ordination of the Lord God, was precisely this union of the animals. They were his keepers. They were themselves the spiritual netting which, when it remained a woven whole, denied him freedom in the universe. Not any individual animal did this thing, but the dear love among all the animals, community, that was warp and woof. Therefore, Worm's bloody bid for freedom had for him the final effect of cinching the net tighter around himself. For they loved one another the more, and in loving are the weakest strongest. No wonder then that all the animals, all wordlessly, let Russell's snoring call them to new roosts, new digs, and a new home, however temporary. Well, the coop they once inhabited had fallen in the earth crack too. Where else had they to go, if not to one another? In the evening, in the night, 29 hens sat like globes of fruit in the branches of the maple tree, and 7 mice had dug themselves a new hole at its roots, and a weasel lurked not far away. And Chanticleer crowed from the lowest branch a soft, familiar compline, to make this place and this particular night less alien. This is how he wrestled darkness. And the hens tucked their heads beneath their wings. They settled down to little homely clucks, and finally to sleep. Chanticleer listened to the fox's snoring. Soon he heard Pertolote's humming from beside the fox. 2 questions arose in him. Aloud he called to Pertolote, "Is he sleeping? Is it good?" After a silence she answered, "He's sleeping, Chanticleer, but I'll tell you the truth. I don't know how good it is. He cannot eat, sleep. He cannot heal unnourished." In his heart was the other question, and the nettle. The rooster had lost another treasure to the war. Worm had killed self-confidence. That quality lay in him like a fetus, dead and decomposing, and no one knew, none. Chanticleer himself could hardly understand his heart's oppression. Simply, silently, and with a passion almost whining, he said, "No one deserves to die any more. No more, no more, Almighty God, not one." Then a trembling sigh and helpless eyes to heaven. Will you come and tell me clearly why this worm exists? Chapter 4. The Brothers Mice. Lord Chanticleer had done a shocking thing soon after the war. He had given every one of the animals leave to leave him, if any were so inclined. The brothers mice had heard this permission with bewilderment, and a stinging, as though whipped with briars. This was no freedom. This was no favour to them. Had they offended dear Chanticleer? They went into their hole and put their noses together and said nothing. When finally the youngest, Sam Stag, began softly to cry, the others used his tears as a melting to utter the immediate response of their souls. No, they said. Oh no, how could we leave the dear rooster for anything on earth? And that was that. They didn't leave. Closer than ever they stood with their friends. Warmer than ever were the tuggings of their heart. Brighter than ever the black beads of their eyes. And now in these latter days it was Russell the Fox who had all their attention. With an earnest, soldierly decorum they stood watch at points about their uncle's body, all hours throughout the day. They ran small errands for Perlote. They patted the fox. Incessantly they laid tiny hands on his rude fur and stroked him, making sympathetic squeaks in their throats like, ah, and too bad, and oh, dear uncle. Uncle. He liked that term, therefore they used the term. And Russell snored. Day after day the fox was kept unconscious. This was a risk, as everyone knew, the extremest test of Perlote's medicines and trust in her judgment. But he seemed indeed to be healing, and animals began to smile again, mice especially. Perlote had lanced the swelling and then dabbed and dabbed its discharge. She'd probed and pressed it, rinsed, washed, and dressed it several times a day. Little mice gagged at the stench a fox could make, but manfully they stayed, and dutifully they brought her moss for sponging, thorns for surgical instruments, and choruses of support. Who can cut like the lady hen? No one. Can anyone squeeze pus as good as Perlote? No one. Ah, see that? Ah. They sat around her, when she breathed, so close to Russell's face, their paws crossed at their breasts, their noses high, their backs straight up, 7 pepper shakers of praise. And Russell snored. His face contracted to its normal shape. The inflammation cooled. The snoring became rather a rattling, drier and less moist. And then the mortified flesh around his snout, his jowls, and the interior of his mouth began to harden, like a scab, except that this was not a scab upon his skin, it was his skin. As it hardened, it shrank the further, so that his cheeks withdrew into a constant grin. And then the mice felt silly. Every time they saw the fox's grin, they grinned back, with the quickenings of their spirit, but then they remembered that he was sleeping. He didn't see them grinning at him, and they felt silly. They went and touched the mask forming on his face, which was his face, and felt it to be bony. Lady Hen, they whispered, scratching this casement, this crust, do you think our uncle feels this? If he didn't flinch from my thorn, Woden Stag, he won't feel your nail. Don't worry. No, said Woden Stag Mouse, not my nail. Do you think he feels this? He ran tiny hands all over Russell's face. This hardness? Not yet, said Perlote gently, but he will when he wakes up. Will it hurt my uncle? I expect it will bother him. He won't have joy in a wooden mouth. Ah, poor Russell! But this is the way he'll grow new skin, Woden Stag. He'll grow it underneath the scab, don't you see? And it won't hurt, unless he splits the scab too soon or cracks it to the quick. And how can he do that when 7 brothers watch him night and day to keep him from talking? How? I don't know how. Yes, yes, said the brothers mice. One evening Freytag was gazing closely at Russell's face, when suddenly the right eye flew open, startling the mouse, and he jumped backward. The eyeball turned round, here and there, though the fox moved not another hair. It seemed to find Freytag, who instantly began to nod and smile and wave, all signs of goodwill and greeting, all from a mouse who felt very dumb about what you do for a sick fox whose eye suddenly flies open. "Hello? Hello," he whispered. "Do you see me, uncle? Are you there? Hello?" The eye flashed a moment of recognition, then softened, and the lid came down over it. It closed. "Whoop!" squealed Freytag, darting first one way and then the other, seeking any other waking creature in the world. "News to tell, news to tell." "He's better! I saw it! He opened his eye! We had a talk about this and that! He went back to sleep! Isn't it wonderful? Uncle will be all right!" Did anyone believe Freytag? Well, they went to Russell, assessed the level of his somnolence by plucking hairs from the fox's tail, and pronounced Freytag such a lover of the fox that he fancied his wishes real. They blessed his bright imagination, but they did not believe him. Freytag had a reputation for exaggeration. But those who tell tales, when finally they tell the truth, are deepest cut to still be mistrusted. Freytag scowled. Freytag folded his tiny arms to show his personal offense. "Russell did wake up, and he was healthy, and he looked at me." Then Freytag proved the truth of his assertion by the infallible method of sleeping outside the mouse's hole, while all of his brothers slept inside. This was a mouse of much honor. This was a mouse of very high principles, absolutely to be believed. Therefore he intended to stay out in the cold, at least to midnight, at least till his brothers fell asleep. In the end he never went in. Proofs came as he hadn't expected, and the mouse was granted a vision, a truth he would rather never have known. Russell the fox did indeed wake up. Freytag heard a stirring, a soft depressing of autumn leaves, and sighing. "See?" he thought, and he arose by his hole, put his body erect, trying to pierce the darkness. No one was alert but him, and if he had his way, no one would be alerted until he was sure, until he was the single messenger abroad. The leaves suffered a sudden crunch, then silence. Several punctuated sounds followed, unhappy jerkings, and a mortal gasp as though something had been discovered. Freytag's little hairs rose up. Then a dark figure walked on 4 feet unsteadily, circling, constantly dipping its head. It was Russell, of course. It was the fox up on his legs. Freytag skittered to him, grinning after all. "Uncle! Uncle!" he whispered. The fox swung his head in the mouse's direction. Freytag was excited, but close up the sight stopped him, and he became confused. Russell wore the perpetual grin, open-mouthed, showing teeth between his whiskers, but Russell's eyes were swimming in tears, and a deep groan issued from his chest, a groan that could be shaped into no word at all, merely because his mouth was fixed. He kept dipping his head to scrape his face in the bend of his wrist. He ran his snout into the ground. Then he gazed again at Freytag, as though Freytag might relieve him somehow, or answer questions unpronounced, unpronounceable. "Hello, Uncle," said the mouse, hesitant, pushing a smile onto his face. "So, here you are." said Russell. That's all. That's all he could produce, a rush of air. His eyes swelled even larger, still turned pathetically to Freytag. He struck his nose with a claw so sharply that the mouse jumped. He gazed at Freytag, tears standing hot in his eyes. Poor Freytag. Now he didn't want to be alone with Russell. "Lady Bertolotte," said Freytag, "said that it's only a scab, Uncle, and that you have to wait for a while, and then it will go away. Uncle, please be okay. She said that in time, at the right time, you would peel it off yourself, you see. Please be okay. Please don't be sad. I'll come and pat you on the shoulder all night long." But Russell the fox, grinning and weeping at once, turned into the night and began to move away. Freytag followed. They moved shudderingly. Russell would fall from rubbery legs, and that's when Freytag would talk and touch the fox and tell him about glad things. But Russell always found his legs again, and, extraordinarily, began to trot, his bush-tail dragging earth, his poor nose low, and Freytag was driven to dash. And they went eastward through the wood, as though Russell knew his destination. Soon Freytag realized that the fox was going somewhere on purpose, and the mouse grew nervous. "It's okay if we go back and tell Lord Chanticleer the wonderful news, don't you think, Uncle? And Lady Perlotte, too, now that you're well again, Uncle. What do you think of that idea?" called Freytag. "I myself think it's a good idea. Maybe you could turn around." But Russell grew more and more intent, and faster, not slower, and even his head came up in the process, and Freytag made 1,000 mouse puffs trying to keep pace and catch his breath. And so they went. They came to the Liverbrook, a southward running stream, cold in the autumn but perfectly wet. Straightway Russell the fox plunged his face under water, standing on a level bank. He thrashed his head back and forth, blowing, boiling water. "Well," said Freytag behind him, "that's a good thing to do. No, I never thought of that, washing your face. You're very wise, Uncle." And after a long, long moment, while Russell crouched lower and thrust his neck and forelegs and shoulders deeper into the stream, "Don't you think," said Freytag, "you should breathe, Uncle?" Breathe? He did, in a way that Freytag didn't anticipate. Russell the fox exploded from the water, barking. It was a loud shout he sent into the velvet night. Then giggles, and then true laughter, touched only at its peaks by frenzy. "Freytag!" roared the fox, avuncular. "I am so glad, not to mention pleased, that you are here, which is where I am, which means with me." The mouse smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. His heart was so terribly uncertain. "You are talking," he said. I am that indeed," cried Russell the fox, "and in a minute I will also have something to say," he said, delighted at the prospect. "Could we say it," said Freytag, "to Lord Chanticleer? Uncle, what do you think about that?" And he whispered, "You shouldn't be talking, Uncle." But Russell roared, "I know what!" and a fracture appeared between his nostril and his lip, and it filled with blood, a thin line of blood. The blood laced into wet fur. "I know what!" He turned and climbed northward along the Liverbrook, upstream. Poor Freytag followed. At a limestone ledge, projected 1 foot above the water, Russell stopped. He grinned, a true benevolent grin, upon Freytag the mouse. It wasn't a scab grin any more, but it split flesh in 100 places. Russell lifted his paw in a histrionic pose and announced before his audience of one, "Catching minnows with one's tail." Every split in the fox's mouth bled. "Uncle Russell, please," said Freytag, "I don't want to see any tricks. I don't want to hear of any tricks. I don't want my uncle to be in trouble or in pain, and there's a reason for this, Uncle. I love you. See, why don't we go back now? What if we went back now?" But Russell the fox wasn't listening to Freytag. He was seized by another passion. Unaware, he rubbed his nose with the joint above his paw. Unaware, he smeared blood through his whiskers, making them spiky. Unaware, because his attention was all behind himself, where he was sinking his tail into the water. Yes! Slowly. Yes, yes! Allowing the long fur its swimming separation. "Catching minnows," he said, breathless, glaring at the mouse. "Catching minnows. Foxes have to do with wit, good nephew, since foxes lack other equipment. See? See? This is the true notability of the fox. Wit! See? Listen. The fox introduces his bushy tail into the stream. Uncle, please, as per you see me doing now. You see, tiny mouse? Do you see?" Freytag choked with anguish. Russell's mouth had begun to bubble pink. When the bubbles popped, they spattered mouse fur. "Oh, yes, I see, dear uncle," Freytag squeaked. "Could we please quit now? The word to love," said Russell, panting, gazing hectically at Freytag, grinning, "is seaweed, seaweed, seaweed." The fox spat a great gout of blood. He was bleeding inside his mouth as well. Viciously he scraped his muzzle as though it were a hindrance. Freytag held his own nose between two paws. "Oh, God," said Russell. His eyes began to fill with tears. "God," said Freytag. He, too, was weeping, though through tears they stared at one another. "Now," said Russell, rushing, "now the fox must keep so still, for his tail, silent and waving in the current, is, don't you see, the seaweed? And what of minnows?" "I didn't ask," Freytag pleaded. "Why, minnows congregate in seaweed. There's the trick. Deception. Ha! Quiet now. Be still. Be quiet and wait. Quiet." What could Freytag say? There came now a moment of horrible silence. By an extraordinary will, the fox went rigid, performing his trick, and Freytag stiffened too. But what he saw was his uncle bleeding in streams, and he heard the blood drops potting stone below his chin, and the fox's teeth were outlined in blood. He had savaged his mouth with talking. Yet they held perfectly still, these two, staring at one another. Waiting for what? Minnows? Russell grinned, but his eyes burned, and Freytag thought he would burst soon in screaming. Suddenly Russell moved. It was a whirling movement and a climax. He whipped his tail from the water, slapped it on stone, and minnows began to flip like silver scales. Then he rose to 4 legs, threw his head to heaven, sucked air, and wailed at the top of his lungs, "God, God, it isn't too much to ask! I only want to talk!" That was more than the mouse could stand. Without a thought, he leaped backward, spun, and shot top speed to Chanticleer. Russell was suffering. Russell was racking himself. "He's talking! He's talking!" shrieked the little mouse. "Oh, what'll we do? He's talking!" But that piteous cry of the fox was the last that he ever uttered. The animals, when they came to the Liverbrook, found an abject creature, Russell the fox, shamefully nudging minnows one by one into the stream. This, though every one of them was dead. Chanticleer seized the fox's face in a claw. He held to the moonlight a mouth torn ragged, lips that hung in ribbons, and he cursed the fox, and he cursed in the night, and he terrified the hens, and he said, "Why should I cry for you, Russell? No, I won't cry for you!" But he did, and the mice were stricken helpless by the rooster's tears.